He fought for his country, but when he came home, the town he defended stole his pride and his dog. Months later, the truth surfaced. His loyal service dog had been retrained to attack men who looked like him, but on the night the door opened, what walked in didn't just return. It exposed everything this town tried to bury. The air in Monroe County carried a weight that didn't lift, a kind of heaviness that settled into the bones of those who had lived there too long. When Caleb Monroe stepped off the worn Greyhound bus, duffel slung over his shoulder, the quiet street did not greet him with warmth or recognition. The American flag above the courthouse fluttered lazily in the autumn wind, but beneath it, the stares he received carried the chill of unspoken judgment. His uniform no longer earned him salutes here. It only reminded people of what they didn't understand, a black veteran who fought for a country that still measured worth in shades of skin. The Georgia town he called home had changed little since the day he left for the Marines. The cracked sidewalks, the faded paint on the diner sign, and the old oak tree by the church still stood as they always had. What had changed was him. The man who had once walked these streets with a young man's confidence now returned with a limp in his step, and ghosts that followed him wherever he went. His closest companion, Rex, a disciplined German shepherd trained to detect explosives and danger before men could see it coming, was gone, disappeared during a police raid that spun out of control. Caleb had survived, but it didn't feel like survival. It felt like punishment. He rented a small house on the edge of town, surrounded by fields that had long since lost their crop. The neighbors barely waved. The white couple across the road watched him unload his belongings with quiet discomfort, whispering behind half-closed curtains. Down the street, a black mechanic named Warren nodded once in silent acknowledgement, but didn't cross over. Everyone knew Caleb's story, the Marine who came home with scars no one could see, and a loyalty to a dog that the police claimed had turned on him before vanishing into the night. They didn't ask questions because questions required care, and care was something this town gave out sparingly. At night, the house felt too large for one man. The sound of crickets and the faint whistle of trains passing through the valley filled the silence. Caleb would sit on his porch, staring at the dirt road illuminated by the dim glow of his porch light, waiting for a sound he both feared and longed to hear, Rex's bark. Sometimes he swore he could still smell the faint scent of the dog's fur, still feel the leash in his hand, still hear the jingle of the tag against Rex's collar. The memory was sharper than the war itself because it was personal. He hadn't just lost a partner. He'd lost the one soul that never looked at him as a black man or a soldier, just as a person worth following. The people of Monroe County had their opinions about him. Some said the raid had been his fault, that he'd been too close to trouble. Others whispered that the police never meant to let him walk free after that night, that it was politics, not justice, that saved him from being blamed. The rumors didn't matter. What mattered was that Rex was gone, and no one cared enough to help him find the truth. He'd gone to the station, asked questions, even begged for reports. The officers had shrugged. One of them, Sheriff Tom Whitner, had once served with him in Afghanistan. Now, he couldn't even look Caleb in the eye. The divide in the town was clearer than ever. The war had given Caleb discipline and courage, but it hadn't prepared him for the quiet racism that seeped into every glance, every denied opportunity, every small humiliation. When he walked into the grocery store, conversations halted. When he passed the church steps, old men turned their heads. To some, he was a hero. To others, he was a threat who had forgotten his place. The war hadn't taught him how to fight that kind of battle, the one that didn't use guns but words, stares, and silence. Still, Caleb clung to hope. Somewhere deep down, he believed Rex was alive. He replayed that last night over and over, the sound of sirens, the shouting, the confusion as they entered the warehouse. He remembered hearing Rex bark, followed by a gunshot and chaos. When the smoke cleared, the dog was gone. The police told him Rex had run off, but Caleb knew his partner. Rex would never run from him. Something had happened, something no one wanted him to uncover. Days turned to weeks, and life moved on for everyone except Caleb. The world had returned to its routine of pretending men like him didn't matter. He spent his days fixing up the old house, trying to rebuild both the walls around him and the ones inside him. Each morning he would check the old trail behind his backyard, a path that led through the woods to the open field where he used to train Rex. The paw prints from years ago had faded, but he still traced them with his eyes as if doing so might summon him back. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky with deep orange and bruised purple, Caleb sat alone on his porch. The stillness of the evening was comforting, the kind that numbed thought. His fingers brushed against the worn metal of Rex's dog tag that hung from his keychain, the only thing the police had returned to him. The inscription had faded, but he could still make out the words, "Loyalty above all." He whispered the phrase under his breath like a prayer, unsure if he believed it any more. Just as he stood to head inside, a sound cut through the quiet, faint but unmistakable. A bark, deep, familiar, and close. Caleb froze. His heart hammered as he stepped toward the porch railing, scanning the dark stretch of the road. The barking came again, sharper this time, echoing off the trees. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't memory. It was real. He fumbled for the flashlight and swung it toward the sound, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Rex?" The name slipped out like breath, a whisper carried by hope and disbelief. The barking stopped. For a long moment the night was silent again, so still that Caleb could hear the pulse in his ears. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped toward the door, hand trembling as he reached for the knob. The wind rustled through the trees as he opened it, half expecting to see the outline of a dog charging toward him. But there was only emptiness, the sound of the night returning to normal, as if nothing had happened. The road was deserted, the shadows unchanged, yet something had shifted inside him. Hope, fragile and dangerous, had returned, and with it, a question that refused to rest. What if Rex was still out there, calling him home? The following week arrived with the same uneasy stillness that seemed to settle over everything in Monroe County. Morning stretched long and heavy. Sunlight sliding across the porch like it, too, was reluctant to touch this place. Caleb Monroe's days had fallen into rhythm. Coffee gone cold before sunrise, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, and a silence that never quite felt empty, only waiting. But that waiting changed the morning he opened his mailbox and found the first letter. It was folded neatly, no return address, just his name typed in all capital letters. Caleb Monroe. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and oil, a scent that carried memories he didn't want to recall. The message was brief. "Your dog ain't dead. He's where he belongs. Maybe you should have stayed gone." There was no signature, just a faint smudge at the bottom, the outline of a thumb stained with dirt. For a long time, Caleb just stood there on his porch, the letter trembling slightly between his fingers. Something in him wanted to dismiss it as a cruel joke. Another small-town whisper meant to remind him he didn't belong here, but the words burrowed under his skin like splinters. That night, sleep was not kind. When it came, it dragged him backward into the sand and smoke of a different world, a memory of Kandahar, 2012. The air had been blistering, thick with dust. His squad had been pinned down, their path cut by a buried IED. He remembered Rex moving ahead, ears perked, tail stiff. The signal they all trusted. Then the explosion came, not beneath them, but ahead, saving their lives. Among those lives was Tom Whitner, then just Sergeant Whitner, who had looked at Caleb that day with something close to brotherhood. Back then, race had no rank. It was survival that bound them. Now, years later, that same man wore a badge, a clean uniform, and the kind of smile that hid distance behind it. The second letter arrived 3 days later. This time the tone was sharper, uglier. "He ain't your kind of hero, boy. Some of us take better care of what you lost." Caleb stared at those words until the edges of the paper blurred. He didn't tell anyone. He knew how it would sound. The lonely veteran chasing ghosts, haunted by a dog that was probably long gone, but the details gnawed at him. Whoever was writing knew too much, knew the story that the police had buried under reports and excuses. Caleb tried to drown the noise with work, fixing the broken fence behind his house and painting over the peeling walls inside. But each night, he'd sit at his table with those letters spread before him, tracing the typewritten words as if they could lead him somewhere. It wasn't until he noticed the faint watermark on the second page, the emblem of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, that the truth struck him cold. Someone close to law enforcement had written it, someone who wanted him to stop looking. The next morning, Caleb drove into town, the letters folded inside his jacket. The sheriff's office sat beside the courthouse, a squat brick building with chipped paint and a flag that always hung limp. Inside, the smell of coffee and disinfectant lingered. Sheriff Tom Whitner stood behind the counter, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair trimmed close, his smile practiced. For a moment, Caleb saw the man he'd once trusted, the one who had shouted over gunfire and shared rations when food was scarce. But time and uniform had reshaped Whitner into something colder. Caleb laid the letters on the counter. "Someone's playing games," he said quietly. Whitner scanned the pages, eyes narrowing slightly before he handed them back. "Probably some kids," he said. "People get ideas. Best not to feed it." There was no concern in his tone, just dismissal wrapped in professionalism. Caleb studied him for a long moment, noticing the faint twitch at the corner of Whitner's mouth. Not fear, but recognition. "You still believe he's out there?" Whitner asked finally. Caleb nodded once. "I have to." Whitner's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Some things are better left buried, Caleb. Dogs don't always come back the same." The words sat between them like a loaded weapon. Caleb left without another word, but as he stepped outside, he saw the faintest flicker of movement from the office window. Whitner watching him go, face unreadable. The memory of Rex refused to fade. He could still feel the dog's heartbeat against his leg, the weight of trust built through years of service. Rex had pulled him out of rubble, detected explosives under children's toys, and stood between him and death more times than Caleb could count. That bond wasn't something that disappeared with a gunshot. And now, these letters, they were a reminder that someone else knew what Rex meant, and they were using it. That evening, rain rolled across the valley, a thin sheet that blurred the road and turned the fields into mirrors. Caleb sat by his window, the stormlight flickering across his hands as he unfolded the letters again. The paper shimmered faintly under the flash of lightning, revealing something he hadn't noticed before. A faint red fiber caught in the crease. It looked like a thread from a harness strap. His heart pounded as he fetched the old duffel that held Rex's training gear. Inside, beneath the patches and metals, lay the torn remains of Rex's first harness. The color matched. The next day he followed the old trail road beyond the edge of town, past the overgrown fields, past the silent grain silos that hadn't turned in years. The letters had mentioned where he belongs, and the only place that phrase made sense was near the old Dillard barn, a place people whispered about but rarely visited. The structure had been abandoned decades ago, leaning crooked against the wind, its paint long stripped to bare wood. Caleb parked his truck at a distance and approached on foot, every step stirring up memories he'd tried to bury. The barn loomed like a monument to forgotten things. Vines clung to its sides, and the air smelled of rust and wet hay. Caleb hesitated at the entrance, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Inside, shadows shifted across the floor, alive with the sound of dripping water. He moved carefully, scanning the ground until something caught the beam, a torn piece of nylon webbing, darkened by mud. He knelt and picked it up. It was unmistakable. The corner tag bore the faint imprint of military serial numbers, Rex's. His pulse quickened. The letters had been real. Someone had been here, recently. A low creak echoed through the barn, deep and deliberate, like breath moving through old lungs. Caleb froze, eyes darting to the far side of the structure. The heavy wooden door, pushed slightly ajar by the wind, shifted again, this time with purpose. As he raised his light toward it, the beam caught the glisten of wet earth. There, imprinted in the mud, were paw prints, fresh ones. In Monroe County, truth was treated like a trespasser, something to be kept off the property line and away from porch conversations. Caleb Monroe learned that the moment he started asking about the fresh paw prints in the abandoned barn, he knew what he saw, and he knew the torn harness strap in his pocket did not appear there by accident. But every person he approached in town looked through him like he was a man chasing mirages. This was a place that didn't like being reminded of the things it had buried, its history, its prejudice, its cruelty. And now Caleb was stirring up all three. He started quietly, visiting places where people talked without meaning to. The feed store, the auto shop, the crooked little gas station near the highway. He asked about strange activity near the old properties, dogs being brought in late at night, men parking where they didn't belong. Most folks shrugged. A few said they didn't want trouble. One old man muttered that some animals get more care than some people. The words sat in Caleb's chest like a cinder. He understood then that this wasn't only about a missing service dog. This was about a town that had decided which lives were worth saving and which were worth using. The deeper he looked, the uglier the picture became. There were rumors, never spoken loudly, of a ring that brought in strong dogs, trained them hard, forced them into contests that weren't spoken of in daylight. Caleb never saw the fights themselves, but he saw the aftermath in whispers and half-cleaned trucks. What chilled him more was the names attached to it. Not drifters, not criminals from out of town, deacons, business owners, a former councilman, men who shook hands on Sundays and talked patriotism on the 4th of July. Men who would have called Rex a fine animal while chaining him up for profit. As Caleb pieced it together, memories of how the town once celebrated him came back like bitter aftertaste. He remembered the parade when he first returned from Afghanistan, the local paper printing "Hometown Hero Returns," the mayor shaking his hand, the church inviting him to speak. For a brief moment, the color of his skin had been secondary to the uniform he wore. He had stood on that stage with Rex beside him, the dog alert and proud, and the town had clapped. But when the uniform came off, when the trauma stayed, when a black veteran started asking for accountability, that applause faded. He wasn't the poster soldier anymore. He was a reminder of promises America made and didn't keep. The shift became visible. One morning he walked out to find his mailbox sprayed with red paint, a slur that didn't even bother to be creative, just hateful. The paint dripped in the Georgia heat, but no one came over to help him wash it off. The white neighbor across the road pretended not to see. The black mechanic down the street gave him a look that said, "Be careful, they're watching." At the diner, forks clinked louder when he walked in, as if they could drown him out. He could hear the mutters, "Should have stayed overseas." Always stirring, acting like that dog was human. Racism in Monroe County didn't always scream. Sometimes it just stepped out of the way and let damage happen. It was around that time that Amelia Reyes appeared. Not from town, not tied to anyone's gossip circle. She drove in from Macon in a dusty sedan with a camera bag and a notebook that looked like it had collected more stories than the people she interviewed. Amelia was young, mid-20s, sharp-eyed, Latina, and entirely unafraid of being stared at by people who did not want her there. She had heard about Caleb's letters through a contact at the state paper and followed the thread. To her, this wasn't only a local story. It was a pattern. Veterans ignored, animals exploited, racism smoothed. Over with polite smiles, she met Caleb on his porch and listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing only when he mentioned Sheriff Tom Whitner's dismissive response. For Amelia, Caleb was the kind of subject journalists rarely got, principled, wounded, and still loyal to something bigger than himself. She saw in him the outline of a story America liked to claim but not tell. A black Marine who gave his strength overseas and returned to a town that believed men like him should be grateful and quiet. Amelia dug into property records, police reports, and complaint calls. She found gaps. Calls about dogs being transported at night that were never followed up. Noise complaints near the old farm road that disappeared from official logs. Citations that should have triggered investigation, but didn't. Every gap pointed to protection, and protection always pointed to power. As Amelia and Caleb compared notes, hope returned to him in a way that didn't feel foolish this time. The harness scrap, the paw prints, the letters, the sudden hostility, it all threaded together. If someone was threatening him, it meant someone had something to hide. And if they had something to hide, it meant Rex might still be alive, kept somewhere, used for something he was never meant for. The thought both enraged and strengthened him. Rex wasn't just a dog. He was a piece of Caleb's service, a piece of his dignity. Saving him now wasn't only rescue, it was reclamation. But the town pushed back. 2 days after Amelia started asking around, the diner refused to serve her. The clerk at the courthouse told her certain records were misplaced. A man in a pickup followed her car out of town, just long enough to make the message clear. Caleb warned her that Monroe County didn't like lights being shined into its corners, especially not by outsiders and not by people of color. Amelia only wrote more. She told him that silence was how corruption lived this long. He believed her because he had lived that silence himself. That evening, after a long day of knocking on closed doors, Amelia returned to her motel room on the edge of town. The hallway lights flickered, the kind of place used more by truckers than reporters. A plain envelope sat on the floor, shoved under her door. No name, no stamp. She locked the door behind her before opening it. Inside was a single photograph, printed in low light but clear enough to stab. Rex, chained to a post, ribs visible beneath dirty fur, eyes alert but tired. His service ear notch, the small identifying cut, was unmistakable. Beneath the photo was a scrap of paper with typed words, "Stop digging. Some dogs forget. You should too." At the bottom, a date was printed. It was from 2 days ago. The town had forgotten him, but someone was watching every move they made, and Rex was still alive, suffering in silence. Silence settled over Monroe County like a second atmosphere, heavy and intentional, the kind that kept ugly things alive because no one wanted to name them. For Caleb and Amelia, that silence became their enemy. They both felt it from different angles. Caleb as the veteran the town no longer wanted to celebrate. Amelia as the Latina outsider asking questions no one welcomed. Their alliance wasn't born out of friendship at first, but out of necessity. Both of them understood what it meant to be tolerated but not accepted, seen but not helped. Both knew that if they didn't uncover what was happening to Rex, no one would. The photo Amelia received stayed on Caleb's table for days like a wound left open. He studied every corner, the dirt floor, the chain fixed to a wooden post, the shadow of a structure behind him, the shape of fencing that did not look like a normal kennel. Rex's eyes held the same alertness, but there was something new now. Fatigue, as if he had been made to perform for people who did not see him as a partner, but as property. The date on the photo told them everything. This was current, not a relic. Someone within driving distance had him. Someone confident enough to threaten them. Amelia was the first to suggest looking into local licenses, breeders, kennels, and agricultural reports. She spent hours in the county clerk's office, her presence drawing narrowed looks from staff who pretended documents couldn't be found. But Amelia was relentless. When records weren't handed to her, she searched public logs. When public logs were incomplete, she asked regional offices. That was how she found repeated mentions of the Dillard property, listed over the years under different purposes. Breeding, animal boarding, livestock training. The name that appeared most frequently was Hank Dillard, a man old enough to be respected, but young enough to still be dangerous in his certainty about who belonged where. Caleb knew the Dillard name. Everyone did. Hank's family owned land on the outskirts, near the old barn, where Caleb had found Rex's torn harness piece. They were white, proud, and known for their love of working dogs, a phrase Caleb now understood as something flexible enough to hide cruelty. What made it worse was what Amelia uncovered next. Hank had a long-term, almost friendly association with the sheriff's office. Permits were approved quickly for him. Complaints near his property often disappeared. Visitors from out of town were never questioned when they went there. That pattern would have been suspicious on its own, but Amelia kept pulling. One night, sitting at Caleb's kitchen table surrounded by files, she slid a document toward him, a financial report tied to a regional livestock auction, the kind of thing people assumed no one read. Caleb's eyes caught the name immediately, Thomas Whitner. The sheriff wasn't just ignoring reports, he was receiving payments through shell events tied to animal exhibitions. The wording was vague, but the amounts weren't. Whitner was profiting from animal events held outside town, supported by families like the Dillards. The realization hit Caleb harder than he expected. He had once knelt beside Whitner in a dusty Afghan alley, both of them trusting each other with their lives. Whitner had clapped him on the back after a successful mission, had praised Rex, had called him brother. Now that same man was turning away from him, not out of ignorance, but because money, influence, and the safety of white reputations mattered more than the loyalty they'd once shared. Caleb felt something sharp coil inside him. Not hatred, but grief. Grief for a bond he thought was real. Grief for trusting a man who had never really stood where he stood. The weight of that betrayal made the town's racism feel sharper. A slur on a mailbox was one thing. A man he'd saved now choosing comfort over justice was another. Caleb had always believed that service proved worth, that putting on the uniform bought him, at minimum, respect. Monroe County proved otherwise. Here, he was still a black man trying to reclaim something that certain people believed he had no right to call his. So he and Amelia shifted their approach. They stopped asking publicly and started watching quietly. They drove past Hank Dillard's land at different hours, noting vehicles, listening for dogs. The property sat behind a long gravel road, fenced and posted with signs about trespassing. Beyond the main house was a long, low structure, too well kept to be abandoned, too large to be just a storage shed. At night, a single floodlight washed over the yard, and sometimes faintly, the sound of animals carried over the wind, not playful barking, strained, controlled, trained noise. They began gathering evidence carefully. Amelia photographed license plates. Caleb traced connections between the cars and local businessmen who sat in the front pews of church on Sundays. Their list of names grew. Men whose wives chaired charity drives, men who spoke about community values, men who claimed to support veterans while quietly paying to watch dogs tear each other apart. Caleb never saw the fights themselves, and neither of them wanted to witness them. But the pattern was too strong to ignore. This was more than a random act of cruelty. It was a system, protected from the top down. And at the center of that protection stood Sheriff Tom Whitner. The more they uncovered, the more Caleb wrestled with what to do. Confronting Hank meant exposing the whole ring, which meant exposing Whitner, which meant inviting the town's full hostility. Walking away meant living with the knowledge that Rex was being used, paraded, possibly broken. For a man whose entire life had been built on loyalty to his unit, his dog, his oath, walking away was harder than marching into enemy territory. But this enemy wasn't across the ocean. It was his own hometown, his own people, and they could ruin him without ever raising a hand. On a humid night thick with the smell of pine and distant rain, Caleb and Amelia parked off the main road near the Dillard property, far enough to avoid the security light, close enough to see the gate. Crickets sang in restless waves. The house itself was dark, except for the rear outbuilding, where a faint yellow glow leaked from a side window. They watched from inside the car, windows cracked, breath held, camera ready. Then it happened. From the shadows near the gate, a figure emerged on 4 legs. The dog moved with caution, body leaner than before, coat scarred in places where fur should have been smooth. A chain clinked softly as he stepped forward. The floodlight caught his face, and Caleb's heart clenched. It was Rex, but not the Rex he remembered. This dog's eyes were harder, trained, his ears flicking not in curiosity, but in suspicion. He stared toward the road as if sensing them, lips lifting just enough to show tension. Not wild aggression, but conditioned alertness. Rex stood at the gate, growling low, scarred and unrecognizable, as if daring whoever watched to come closer. Night pressed down on the Dillard property like a secret trying not to be revealed. From the cover of the parked car and the tree line, Caleb watched the dog that had once been his partner stand guard for another man. The sight of Rex pacing along the inside of the fence with that chain dragging behind him was more painful than any injury the war had given him. This wasn't just a lost dog anymore. This was proof that someone had taken loyalty, something sacred between Handler and K9, and reshaped it into something small, ugly, and obedient to hate. The idea that Rex had been trained to see him not as a leader, but as a target struck Caleb with a deep, breath-stealing grief. Rex's posture told the whole story. He was not relaxed, not joyful, not recognizing a familiar presence. His shoulders were tense, his eyes scanning, his ears flicking toward every shift of air. Caleb recognized the signs of conditioning, the way a dog was made to respond first and question later. He had trained dogs to protect bases, to detect explosives, to respond to danger without hesitation. He had never trained one to judge a human by skin. That was a human teaching, not a military one. That was Monroe County leaking its poison into an animal that once knew nothing but duty. Caleb's throat tightened as realization dawned with brutal clarity. Whoever had Rex had reconditioned him to respond to appearance, to color. It was not difficult to imagine how it had happened. Handlers who laughed while forcing the dog to react to darker-skinned men. Commands paired with punishment. Praise paired with targeting. A creature built for service had been turned into a tool for prejudice. The same racism that watched Caleb from kitchen windows had reached into his most sacred bond and twisted it. For a moment, Caleb wanted to leave, not because he didn't love Rex, but because seeing him like this felt like standing over a grave that wasn't supposed to exist. He had held on to the memory of Rex as a symbol of what the military had done right, men and dogs working beyond race, beyond flags, for something human. To see that symbol broken felt like a betrayal of his entire service. His eyes stung, and he blinked hard, turning away as if that might make the image fade. Amelia, watching from the passenger side, saw his shoulders slump and understood the kind of hurt he was carrying. She had covered stories about corruption before, but this was different. This was personal, layered, historical. She leaned closer, her voice low and steady, reminding him that this was not only about taking back his dog, it was about refusing to let the town rewrite his story. She reminded him that men like Whitner and breeders like Hank were counting on his silence, on his exhaustion, on his belief that he didn't deserve to reclaim what was his. If he walked away now, they won. If he stepped forward, he forced truth into daylight. Caleb steadied himself. He wiped at his face, anger and sorrow meeting in his chest. Then he made a decision he knew could break him. He would try to reach Rex the only way he knew how. Not with force, not with panic, but with memory. The dog might have been retrained, but deep inside him, there were still commands that belonged only to Caleb. Commands spoken in low tones in deserts and compounds. Commands learned in trust, not fear. He stepped out of the car, moving slowly, hands visible, body angled to appear non-threatening. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, loud in the still night. Rex's head snapped toward him immediately. The growl that came from the dog's chest was low and automatic, the kind that warned rather than attacked. Caleb could see the confusion in his eyes. Recognition fighting with new training. The floodlight washed over Caleb's face, making his skin clear against the darkness. That was what Rex had been conditioned to respond to, and the dog's body tensed further. Caleb stopped several yards from the gate. He lowered his head slightly, the way he used to during operations to show Rex that the situation was controlled. Then, in a quiet, steady tone that carried years of service behind it, he spoke the first of their old commands. It was not shouted, it was given, like a promise. The word hung in the air between them. Rex's growl faltered. His ears shifted back for a fraction of a second, not in threat but in thought. Caleb saw it. The flicker of the dog he knew. He followed with another command, this one used only after missions, when Rex was to return to his side. Again, the dog hesitated. His claws scraped the dirt as he took half a step forward, then stopped as if another harsher memory yanked him back. Someone else had overlaid Caleb's voice with new expectations. Someone else had taught Rex that. Approaching a man like Caleb brought punishment. The internal war inside the animal was almost painful to witness. Rex's tail was rigid, his breathing fast, his eyes moving from Caleb's face to the house and back again. Caleb's heart pounded, but he didn't advance. He knew trust couldn't be forced in one night, not after months of conditioning. He kept speaking, each word like a rope tossed across a chasm. He reminded Rex of who he had been, of the desert sun, of long patrols, of nights when they had slept side by side because danger was close. He reminded him of loyalty without cruelty. For a breathtaking moment, it seemed to work. Rex lowered his head, the growl thinning into a whine of recognition. His body leaned forward, weight shifting toward Caleb. Muscles no longer coiled to strike. Caleb's chest ached with relief. The dog was still in there. The training the town had tried to put over him was not complete. There was still that piece of loyal soldier left. But the spell cracked when a harsh light burst on from the side of the house and footsteps pounded across the yard. A door slammed. Caleb turned sharply to see Hank Dillard storming toward the fence line, anger written across his face. The kind of anger born not only from being trespassed upon, but from being exposed. Hank was the kind of man who believed ownership was the same as worth, And right now, he believed something that belonged to him was answering to someone else. Hank lifted his shotgun, not firing, but making the threat visible, his mouth moving as he shouted toward Caleb that he had no right to take back what he had lost. The words were laced with the same old belief the town carried, that certain men didn't get second chances, that certain loyalties weren't theirs to reclaim. Caleb stood frozen, not from fear of the weapon, but from the shock of realizing just how far these men were willing to go to keep Rex and keep their ring hidden. Behind him, Amelia reached for a camera, and in front of him, Rex tensed again, torn between the voice of his true handler and the command of the man who now claimed him. Justice in Monroe County did not arrive with sirens or marching footsteps. It came quietly, through paperwork written to look legitimate and handcuffs used not to protect, but to punish. The morning after the confrontation at Hank Dillard's fence, Sheriff Tom Whitner pulled up outside Caleb Monroe's house with 2 deputies, not in anger, but in the calm, measured manner of a man who believed the system would always side with him. Caleb was arrested on charges of trespassing, attempted theft of private property, and interfering with county investigations. The wording was neat, official, stripped of all the context that mattered. No mention of a stolen service dog, of racist conditioning, of a ring protected by people in uniform. On paper, it looked like a black veteran had tried to take something that did not belong to him. That was exactly how they wanted it to look. News spread through town faster than rain on hot pavement. People talked in whispers at the post office and grocery store, their voices low, not out of concern, but self-preservation. Some said Caleb had finally snapped. Others said the Marine in him could not leave trouble alone. A few remembered the parade years ago and shook their heads with something like regret. But almost no one stepped forward to defend him publicly. To defend him would mean accusing the sheriff, and accusing the sheriff would mean admitting that Monroe County's justice was selective. Silence, once again, became the town's shield. Amelia refused to let it stay that way. While Caleb sat in county holding, she worked without pause, publishing the first of her pieces through a regional outlet willing to take small-town corruption seriously. She laid out the pattern with precision: the disappearance of a decorated K-9, the letters laced with racism, the suspicious protection around Hank Dillard's property, the sheriff's financial ties to local animal events. She did not accuse without evidence, but she told the story in a way that made people see what had been in front of them for years. She framed Caleb not as a criminal, but as a veteran stripped of his dignity by the very community that once applauded him. Her work made ripples, not waves yet, but ripples big enough that Whitner felt the pressure. He could no longer pretend this was just a trespassing case. Eyes outside Monroe County were now watching. Sitting in the holding cell, Caleb was transported back to overseas nights when he and Rex waited for extraction. The cinder block walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, the taste of waiting, all of it echoed those moments. Except this time, the enemy was not a distant insurgent, but a familiar system. He thought about the day that he had pulled Whitner out of a collapsed building, dust burning his throat, Rex barking as they dragged him to safety. Back then, loyalty had been uncomplicated. Men bled for each other without checking skin tone, without wondering how that debt would be repaid. Now that debt sat unpaid, drowned in bureaucracy and old prejudice. The contrast stung, but even in that hurt, Caleb found no room for hatred. He had seen what hate did. He had seen villages turn on themselves. He would not let Monroe County do that to him. When the preliminary hearing was set, Caleb made a decision that surprised even Amelia. He told her he would testify, not just to clear his name, but to speak on record about the corruption he had seen. Testifying meant exposing Whitner. It meant making enemies of men who held power in church, business, and land. It meant risking any chance of a quiet life in the town he had once called home. But Caleb understood something deeper now. This was no longer about one dog. This was about who got to define loyalty. Whitner and Hank believed loyalty meant silence to protect their own. Caleb believed loyalty meant telling the truth, even when it shattered the image of the town. That belief was the last honorable piece of his service, and he refused to surrender it. The day of the hearing arrived humid and gray, clouds hanging low as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The courthouse was fuller than usual, not packed, but occupied by people who pretended to be there for other business. Amelia sat near the back with her notes, camera ready if they allowed it, resolve hardening her features. Whitner stood with practiced authority, his uniform crisp, his expression controlled. Hank Dillard did not enter the room, but remained nearby, his presence felt through whispered exchanges. The judge, an older man who had known the Dillard and Whitner families for decades, looked weary before anything even began. Caleb was brought in wearing county-issued clothes, shoulders squared, face calm. He did not look like a man defeated. He looked like a man prepared to speak. Statements began, formal and slow, wrapped in legal language that tried to make trespassing sound like an unprovoked act. Caleb listened, letting the prosecution paint him as impulsive. When it was his turn, he lifted his head and spoke steadily about service, about the bond with Rex, about the evidence they had collected, about the photo dated 2 days earlier showing a military K-9 in chains. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse with insults. He laid out truth like a soldier filing a report. In that quiet delivery was something stronger than anger, dignity. It was the kind of courage the town was not used to seeing in court, courage that didn't demand applause, but demanded recognition. For a moment, even those who didn't like him had to listen. Then, in the middle of that tense stillness, a sound broke through the thick walls of the courthouse. It was faint at first, almost like wind brushing against wood. Then it came again, sharper, rhythmic. The sound of paws, heavy and insistent, scratching at the courthouse door. For a heartbeat, no one in the Monroe County Courthouse moved. The sound came again, steady, insistent, like someone determined to be let in. People turned in their seats. The judge paused mid-sentence, and Sheriff Tom Whitner's eyes narrowed with the kind of alertness that comes from knowing your control is slipping. Then the heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom eased open, not by an officer, not by court staff, but from the outside, pushed just enough to let in a shape that did not belong in such a place. A German shepherd, limping but upright, stepped over the threshold. The chain that once held him had been cut. The collar still hung around his neck, and his fur bore the rough marks of neglect. Rex had come to court. Whispers rose like wind through tall grass. 2 men from town, a mechanic named Warren and an older white farmer Caleb vaguely recognized from church years ago, stood in the doorway behind Rex, faces nervous but resolute. They had freed him. They had done what the sheriff should have done, what the town should have insisted on. For once, someone other than Caleb and Amelia had chosen truth over comfort. That simple act undid months of silence. It showed everyone in that room that they could have acted sooner. It showed Whitner that his authority was breakable. Rex paused, scanning the room. He was thinner, carrying a slight hitch in his back leg, and scars broke the smooth pattern of his coat. He looked like a dog who had been used, not loved. But when his gaze landed on Caleb, seated at the defendant's table with his hands cuffed, something shifted. The alert tension in his body softened, ears tilting forward, eyes widening with recognition. Whatever conditioning Hank Dillard had tried to pound into him could not erase the sound of the voice that had once called him to safety in deserts far from here. Caleb's throat closed. He leaned forward, forgotten by the deputies standing near him, and called Rex's name in that same low tone he had used in service. The courtroom fell utterly silent, the tension so tight it felt like glass. Rex took one step, then another, claws clacking against the worn courthouse floor. When a bailiff moved to intercept him, the judge, perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of some instinct for drama, lifted a hand and told everyone to stand down. No one dared interfere as the battered service dog crossed the room toward the man he had once followed into danger. When Rex reached him, he paused, nose twitching, eyes studying Caleb's face as if confirming this wasn't another test. Caleb lifted his cuffed hands slightly, palms open. Rex exhaled a long, tired breath and lowered his head into Caleb's lap. It was a small movement, but it broke the whole room. The reunion was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and reverent, the kind of moment that left no one with an excuse. This was not property. This was not a stolen animal. This was a veteran reunited with his partner. A bond the town had tried to sever because it was inconvenient to their lives. Amelia felt tears sting her eyes as she lifted her camera, capturing the exact second Rex surrendered to the safety of Caleb's touch. Around her, reporters from nearby counties who had come because of her article began recording. Suddenly, this was no longer a local judge in a small Georgia courtroom deciding on a trespassing case. This was a public reckoning. Cameras meant accountability. Accountability meant Whitner could not keep pretending he knew nothing. Faced with proof on 4 legs, the narrative collapsed. Amelia's published findings had already laid out the payments, the permits, the ignored complaints. Now the dog himself stood as living evidence. Under the weight of questioning eyes, Sheriff Whitner's composure thinned. The judge, flipping through the file, began to ask why a military K-9 was ever in civilian possession, why the sheriff's office had failed to act on the photo dated 2 days prior, why 2 civilians had been able to retrieve the dog when law enforcement had not. Whitner tried to answer with procedure and jurisdiction, but his words sounded small next to the sight of Rex pressing closer to Caleb as if afraid he might be taken again. Outside the courthouse, deputies reported that Hank Dillard's truck was gone. He had left town the moment word spread that Amelia's story had made it to regional news. A man willing to abuse animals and lean on racism for profit was brave only when hidden. With him gone and Rex present, it became obvious who had been protecting whom. Whitner's involvement was no longer rumor. It was motive. It was neglect. It was participation. The townspeople who had come to watch out of curiosity now had to look at themselves. For years they had pretended that racism in Monroe County was old history, that everyone got along as people stayed in their lane. But this moment exposed how easily they looked away when a black veteran asked for help, how quickly they believed a dog belonged to a white breeder over the man who had trained him to save lives. Their civility had been a thin coat of paint over rotting wood. Now it was peeling fast. Caleb sat straighter, Rex still resting in his lap, the dog's eyes closing in exhausted relief. The sheriff was formally asked to step aside pending investigation. The judge ordered a halt on proceedings until the matter of the dog's ownership and chain of custody was resolved. In that instant, the case turned. Caleb was no longer the aggressor. He was the wronged party. The optics alone, a scarred black veteran with his service dog, made denial impossible. It was everything he had fought for, not in rage, but in persistence. As the courthouse slowly descended into controlled chaos, press asking questions, townsfolk murmuring, deputies unsure who to arrest now, Amelia stepped into the hallway to send her footage. Her phone buzzed almost immediately, but it wasn't from her editor. It was from an unknown number. No name, just a message. She opened it, expecting threats. Instead, she found a single sentence on a dark background. "You've only opened one door." She looked back through the glass panel at Caleb and Rex, reunited at last, and understood with a sinking certainty that whatever they had exposed today was only the beginning of what this town had been hiding. Healing did not arrive in Monroe County as a celebration. It came quietly, the way dawn creeps through the cracks of old blinds, hesitant, unsure if it is welcome. Months had passed since the courthouse doors opened and Rex limped across that floor, and though the case had moved into the hands of state investigators, the memory of that day still hovered over the town like a storm that hadn't quite passed. For Caleb Monroe, life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. He no longer walked through town unnoticed. Some people nodded now, awkwardly but sincerely, while others crossed the street to avoid him, unwilling to face what his presence reminded them of. But for the first time since returning home, Caleb did not feel invisible. He felt seen, scars, silence, and all. Rex's recovery had been slow but steady. The limp had faded into a faint hitch, a reminder of where he'd been, not what he was. His fur had grown back over the scars, and his eyes had softened again, no longer flickering with the confusion of mixed commands. Every morning before the sun broke fully over the horizon, Caleb and Rex trained together in the field behind his house. The sessions weren't about combat or commands anymore. They were about rhythm, patience, and restoration. Caleb spoke in the same calm tone he used overseas, and Rex responded with a confidence that seemed to deepen each day. What they were rebuilding was more than obedience. It was trust, reborn, the kind that could survive even the world's worst betrayals. Amelia visited often, sometimes with her camera, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk. Her expose had gone national, picked up by larger outlets that turned the Monroe County scandal into a mirror held up to America itself. Her story wasn't only about one corrupt sheriff or one cruel breeder. It was about how racism hid behind politeness, how systems favored silence, how justice only moved when someone refused to let go. The piece earned her an award for investigative reporting, but she spoke little about that. What mattered to her was that people read it, that it reached veterans across the country who saw themselves in Caleb's story, who felt forgotten but not voiceless anymore. Caleb used the attention not for himself, but for something larger. He began volunteering with an organization that supported veterans transitioning back into civilian life, particularly those who felt unwelcome because of race or disability. With help from state funding and donations sparked by Amelia's story, he started a small training program that paired rescued dogs with veterans struggling to find purpose again. Rex became the face of that effort, not as a mascot, but as proof of what healing looked like when given a second chance. The sessions were simple but powerful. Breathing exercises, walking drills, trust commands. Each movement reminded the men and women that loyalty didn't have to be blind. It could be redemptive. The town itself changed in increments. The diner that once fell silent when Caleb entered now displayed a small photo of him and Rex near the register, placed there quietly by the owner's teenage son. The church organized a community cleanup that included both sides of the tracks, something that hadn't happened in decades. Even Sheriff Whitner's replacement, a younger deputy from out of town, held open forums where residents could voice concerns without fear of being silenced. Monroe County wasn't transformed overnight, but it had begun to look itself in the mirror, and that was something. Small apologies surfaced in unexpected ways. A nod at the gas station, a hand extended during a volunteer drive, a letter left on Caleb's porch that simply read, "I was wrong." Still, the air held tension. Change never came without it. Some people whispered that Amelia had ruined the town's reputation, that Caleb had made too much noise, but even those voices grew quieter with time, drowned out by the quiet decency of those trying to do better. And through it all, Rex remained constant, the living reminder that redemption doesn't erase what happened. It proves survival is possible, despite it. One late evening, after a long day at the training field, Caleb stood on his porch watching the horizon fade from orange to deep indigo. Rex lay at his feet, head resting against his boot, eyes half closed in contentment. The crickets sang, the same as they always had, but the sound no longer felt lonely. It felt alive. Amelia's taillights disappeared down the road, her latest visit over, her promise to return soon still hanging in the air. Caleb breathed in the scent of pine and wet earth, the same smell that had filled that night months ago, when he thought he heard Rex's bark and opened a door to nothing. He thought about how much had changed since then, not just around him, but inside him. The town's hatred hadn't destroyed him, it had refined him. The silence that once suffocated him had turned into space for purpose. He no longer saw the porch as a waiting place. It had become a threshold, a point of return. The door that had opened that night wasn't just for a dog to walk through. It had been the beginning of something larger, a quiet invitation to redemption. As the last streaks of sunset faded, Caleb knelt beside Rex, running his hand through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth beneath it. He whispered the same command he used the first day they trained again, a simple word meaning rest. Rex obeyed, settling deeper. Against him, tail flicking once before stilling. The world around them was not perfect. Racism still lingered in corners. Justice still lagged behind truth, and pain still waited in memories. But for now, peace existed in this small pocket of Georgia, fragile but real. Forgiveness had not come easily. It had not erased the hurt or the betrayal. It had come through action, through rebuilding, through standing firm when it would have been easier to leave. It was forgiveness without forgetting, hope without denial, love without condition. As the night deepened, Caleb looked out toward the road, the same dirt path that once echoed with loss and now glowed faintly under the moonlight. He smiled, quiet and sure. Sometimes the door that opens isn't about what returns. It's about who you become waiting for it. If stories of loyalty, truth, and second chances still move something inside you, then maybe this one reminded you why silence should never win. Share this story with someone who still believes that love can outlast hate, and subscribe for more journeys that speak where words often fail. Before you go, tell me honestly, if the door opened for you, would you have the courage to walk through it?